Erev Tov, good evening. We are together on page, thank you, Devar Miriam, 17 of the Roman numerals, 15. I said someone wrote it, I don't know who it was. 15 in the PDF. And we're up to the next section of Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine's introduction, which is part of a much longer conversation that he's having with us. Tonight's shul is titled, Are We Really All the Same? And we're going to focus for the next couple of shiurim on major differences in practice between Sepharadim and Ashkenazim and answer this question, are we really all the same? I have to tell you that I hesitate for two reasons. The first is, I don't like to highlight differences between people in general. And the only reason why I'm willing to talk about differences is because the whole purpose of Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine's essay is unity. So if we're going to discuss differences for the sake of unity, I'm willing to have that conversation. I was once sitting with Rav Yaakov Peretz, Shilov Miwal Mori Harav, in a taxi. And the taxi driver, it was a little bit of a drive, the taxi driver, who was very clearly Moroccan and very clearly understood from Harav Peretz's accent that he was as well, he turns to Harav Peretz and says, Shalom Aleichem, what's your name? Harav Peretz answers. He said, where are you from? He says, Yerushalayim. And then he asks the question that everybody asks. Where are you from? You know that question? People don't really want to know where you're from. Where are you from? Meaning, where did you come from before Yerushalayim? And Harav Peretz looks at him and he said, Lemay nafka mina, which is a Talmudic term saying, what difference does it make? And then proceeded to explain to the taxi driver that we're all living in Eretz Israel. It doesn't really make a difference where I'm from or where you're from. The point is that we're here together today. But if we're going to discuss differences, Harav Peretz's rule, whenever we speak about all the different camps in the Jewish community, to try as much as possible to mention the positive there. The second, I have a problem with pacing. So those of you who've been with me in my shiur for a long time, it's not a real problem. But it's I like to move. I don't mind taking forever to study something as long as we study it well. And that means that when I see a list of 51 things that are different between Sepharadim and Ashkenazim, I don't know if it's the Yetzer Hara, but my inclination is to spend 51 weeks and take each one of these things apart and take apart every difference. Why we do this, why the Bavli, why the Yerushalmi, Rambam, and the Rif, and the Rosh, and to go with you through Minhagim, and in this country and that country. And I understand that there's value in giving a 51-week course on Minhagim. I just don't know that that's the course that you signed up for. And more than that, I'm concerned that if we spend 51 weeks discussing these 51 examples, that we will lose entirely the message that Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine is trying to share with us. So my proposal is as follows. I won't spend 51 weeks. I'm also not going to do this so superficially. I would like to see how long it takes us to get through this list. And if that means we do 10 or 15 things today and 12 next week, that's what I'll do till we finish, B'ezrat Hashem, the 51 items on the list. Isn't it acceptable to you? Yeah, okay. Chaver, those of you who have your cameras on, I really appreciate it. Those of you who don't, I would really appreciate them being on unless you can't, and I totally understand if you can't. Says Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine in the middle of page 17 or 15. Po atzayen, here I'm going to point out קצת שינויים בין השתי עדות, הספרדים והאשכנזים. There's two עדות, עדות המזרח and Ashkenazim. We don't call ourselves really in history עדות המזרח. This seems to happen to us later in our history, but the term Mizrahi Jews that is used, really, I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not an expert in all the ethnic politics that go on, racial politics. There are different people who are experts in these terms. For me, we always Sepharadim and Ashkenazim. They're both vague terms. They're both inaccurate. Like any other term you're going to use, not all Ashkenazi Jews are from Germany. Not all Sephardic Jews are from Spain. We know this already. It seems, though, that this term Mizrachim is used in a few ways. One, especially in the early years of the State of Israel, Mizrachim was intended to lump a bunch of people who were non-European in the same category. And that meant that, ironically, even if you were Sephardic, which is really part of Europe, and you were from Spain, that you might be considered an Easterner because of your affiliation with a group that is not Ashkenazi. Second, this term has been used, and I don't know for how long, to separate the Sephardic community between some type of West and East. And I understand that in the United Kingdom, this is a touchy subject, so I'm treading lightly over here. But for those who have been in my shiurim in the past, Sephardim has nothing to do with one's ethnicity. I can't say nothing. It definitely is a term that connotes some type of ethnicity. But Sephardim is about a philosophy that you affiliate yourself with. If someone tells you, I'm Chabad, you don't assume that he was born in the town of Lubavitch in Russia. You assume that this Jew, regardless of where they come from, affiliates themselves with a certain worldview, a certain philosophy. When someone tells you, I'm Breslev, I go to Uman for Rosh Hashanah, you don't assume that they actually come from a place called Uman. Uman has, I don't know, how many people live in Uman? Nobody. How many people live in Uman? So probably the Jews that come to Uman are more than the people who ever lived in Uman in Uman's history. You don't assume that when they say that means they come from a little village somewhere. You assume they're part of a philosophy that by Sephardim, somehow we've shut down this conversation. We're Sephardim. It means a ethnicity of where we come from, and that's a mistake. It's a mistake because it's not true. It's a mistake because it also keeps certain people away from this form of Judaism that is crucial to, in my opinion, of course, that is crucial to developing one's relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Torah of the Jewish people. From the day that we founded our Kehillat, we have never used the term Sephardi, ever. We're not a Sephardic synagogue, we're not... In fact, the only time I use the term Sephardi is when people try to make us Orthodox. When we're Orthodox, then I become a Sephardi. But that's the only time. Because you know how many people in my Kehillat are not ethnically Sephardim? Who cares? Who cares? When we started our Bet Adin in Los Angeles, the question was, well, you guys should call yourselves the Sephardic Bet Adin. My response? When the other Bet Adin titles themselves the Ashkenazi Bet Adin, I will write the Sephardic Bet Adin. But when it says Bet Adin, and Bet Adin means normal, and then Sephardic means abnormal, when the day school doesn't call itself the Ashkenazi day school, so why should I call it a Sephardic day school? We're Jews with a unique philosophy, but it's accessible to everybody. When my wife, I'll tell you a story. I'm in a storytelling mood. When my wife came to San Diego, we had met in Israel. I had then taken a job to be a rabbi in San Diego at a different community at the time. And there was a Sephardic synagogue on top of an Ashkenazi synagogue. And my wife came for Shabbat, and it was, it was a shidduch, so not everybody knew that we were dating each other. We weren't actually in a relationship per se, and at least not publicly for the world to know. And my wife, who had come to the community for Shabbat, went upstairs to go pray with the Sephardim, obviously to pray with our Kehillat. And someone stopped her on the staircase and said, excuse me, are you Sephardic? You don't belong upstairs. You should come here. And my wife gave them a piece of her mind that just because she looks a certain way doesn't mean she doesn't want to pray up there. And that's when she became the Rabbanit of our community. But this attitude of we are exclusively one thing and therefore you're not welcome here, it's a real problem. It's a real problem. And so, I don't even know where I was going with this idea here. Sephardim, the term Sephardim. It's not perfect, but all these other terms that are meant to break up the Sephardic community into fragments, especially when it comes to East and West. Chacham Fa'ur has a very interesting footnote. Chacham Fa'ur in his book, Rabbi Israel Moshe Chazan, Ha'ishu Mishnato, printed in the 60s, about Rabbi Israel Moshe Chazan. He tracks at which point Sephardim stop being Western, meaning part of Spain, Portugal, civilized culture, and when Sephardim are forced into being Easterners. And that this is part of a shift that happens across the world, to divide the world between East and West. West being modern and cultured and educated, and East being primitive and backwards and whatever else might be. Now, this is obviously not a true differentiation, but this is the way that much of the world, in the Western world, as in the Eastern world, and there's a certain denigration of the East when discussing the East. The East is not cultured. The East is not educated. It doesn't make a difference that they have their own culture. The East has its own educational standards. The East has its own... Doesn't make a difference, but the East is lower than us in the West. And then this became applied to Jews. And then worse, today I see that inside of the Jewish community, especially in the Sephardim, there's this divide, and I struggle with it. What can I tell you? I can't tell you it doesn't exist. I can tell that I don't want it to exist. That's what I can say. So right now, I'm just breaking up the Jewish people into Sepharadim and Ashkenazim. Is it perfect? No, but let's do it. Hen b'minhagei bet knesset, Whether it has to do with the minhagim, the customs of the community, the synagogue. So there are practical differences between Sepharadim and Ashkenazim as to how the Bet Knesset works, how it operates, how you pray, all the customs that happen there. Piyutim, there are different songs that are sung in different communities. I think this is important. It's a little different than the Bet Knesset per se. I don't know what a Sephardic Ne'ilah would sound like if it didn't start with El Nora Alina. That tune, it can be different tunes in different communities, so don't get stuck on it, but El Nora Alina, we hear this tune and all of a sudden our mind gets into Yom Kippur mode. Achot Ketana, Moroccan, Syrian, Spanish, Portuguese, whatever you're going to do. That tune gets you into Rosh Hashanah. For the Ashkenazi soul, I think that a person who's been going for years and years and years to an Ashkenazi synagogue, what is the high holiday without Untane Tokef? Regardless of the historical accuracy of that song. What is it without the 10 martyrs? What is it without certain piyutim that are key piyutim of it, but we don't even have them in our siddur? Those are differences. Are they important differences? Nobody said they're important, but they exist. Nisuim, weddings, we do those things differently. Shabbat v'Yom Tov, differences in our observance of Shabbat and holidays. Nichum Avelim, we should never know. But when it comes to comforting mourners and the like, there are differences. Isur v'heter, you wonder what waited so long for this one, Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine. Isur v'heter, the laws of kashrut. There are minor differences between Sephardim and Ashkenazim when it comes to the laws of kashrut. I know a little bit about that. U'vichlal ikarei dinim v'halachot kvuot. But even in basic halachot that are established, shenityazdu al pi hasafrut hatalmudit u'gdolei haposkim, and the halachic systems both of Sephardim and Ashkenazim, which are both based off of the Talmud, they're both based off of the writings of the giants of the poskim. V'im kol zeh, and nonetheless, despite the fact that our halachic systems are based off of the same works, enam nishlavim, they still don't see eye to eye with each other. They're still not equal to each other. I mean, there are differences throughout life, says Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine, where Sephardim and Ashkenazim simply do things differently. Ma me'od chafatzti le'sof kol hashinuim. Says Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine, I so much desired to gather together all of the differences. Aval ra'iti ki kasha alai la'asoto, ki lezeh nitzrach chibur shalem. He said, I see how difficult it is for me to do it because it would need its own book. It would need to be its own work. It couldn't be the introduction to the Keter Shem Tov. Ve'en hazman marsheni lechach. And the time does not allow me, time does not permit me to start a new book like this. מפני טרדותיי שעלו והשתרגו על צווארי הן בענייני הציבור והן בשיעורי whether because I don't have time, because of the troubles in my life, the yoke that has been put on my neck, the public affairs that I'm involved in, הן בשיעורי שאני מרצה יום יום לחברי הישיבה אוהל משה ויהודית, because I lecture every day in Ohel Moshe Yehudit. I believe this is Moses Montefiore College. More, do you want to help me out here? What's it called today? No, okay, never mind. ויסלחו לי הקוראים אם ארשום אלו השינויים שלא כסדר. And I ask the readers for forgiveness if I even list these differences out of order, most likely out of order of the Shulchan Aruch, meaning it's going to be all over the place. He gathered 51 examples, but they're not all the examples that there are. And this is what I'm offering with the help of my God. So there are many more differences than 51, but these 51 are going to be an example for us about the differences between all of them. The first, this one should come as no surprise. En ha-Sepharadim, he uses Samech for Sephardi and Aleph for Ashkenazim. So he's never going to spell out those words, or not so much. En ha-Sephardim va-Ashkenazim mishtavim benosach ha-tefilot. The Sephardim and the Ashkenazim have different nuschaot, and different versions of the Siddur from which they pray. Now, I think everyone knew this, and there's more than just Sephardic and Ashkenazi. Today you have Bli Anara in the Ashkenazi world, a number of different types of Siddurim. There's Ashkenaz, there's Sfarad, which is not Sephardic. There's a Hasidic Siddur, there's Chabad Siddur, there's a German Siddur, there's all kinds of different Siddurim that exist. By the Sephardim, the same thing. Yeah, so the Sephardim, you have perhaps the East and the West Sephardim. You have those who are a little more Kabbalistically influenced, those who are less. You have a Moroccan Siddur and a Syrian Siddur, and all of these Siddurim are a little bit different from each other. You have a Yemenite Siddur, which is a completely different playing field than other, depending which Yemenites. Are they Shami Yemenites? Are they Baladi Yemenites? Which Yemenites are they from? All of those are different Siddurim. But he writes here in the footnote, if you look in footnote 44, Nosach HaTefilah LeSfaradim, the version of Tefillah of Sephardim, Nishlach Lahem, was sent to the Sfaradim al yedei Rav Amram Gaon. Rabbeinu Amram Gaon, one of the Gaonim, וזה היה כאשר שלח רבן יצחק, אחד מגאוני ספרד, את בנו רבי יעקב. And this happened when Rabbeinu Yitzchak, one of the Gaonim of Sefarad, sent his son, Rabbi Yaakov, לרבי Amram Gaon, ועשרה או 20 זהובים בידו, he brought with him 10 or 20 gold coins in his hand, לתת לו בעד שכר הסופר להעתיק לו הסידור. He went not to pay Rabbi Amram Gaon for the Siddur, but he went to pay for the expense of having a person. There's no photocopy machine. There's no file you could take and put in your computer. They had to write it. If I wanted a Siddur from you, I had to hire somebody who would copy over the Siddur from one book onto a blank book. He gives you a source here. ונוסח סידור אשכנז בא להם על ידי רבנו שמחה מוויטרי, הנקרא מחזור ויטרי. And Nosach Ashkenaz came to the Ashkenazim from Rabbeinu Simcha of Vitri. It's called the Machzor Vitri. But if I am not mistaken, Machzor Vitri is a student of who? I believe of Rashi. You can check me on that, but if I'm not mistaken, there's a connection there to the camp of Rashi, but I don't know. Now there's a fantastical history, I say history lightly, of the differences between Sephardic and Ashkenazi Siddurim found in the back of the book Noam Elimelech. Noam Elimelech is a Hasidic work of Rabbi Elimelech of Lezhensk. And in the back of that work, there's, the name is eluding me now, the Rabbanit once helped me look it up. Sefer Shoshanim, Likut Shoshanim, something about a rose, a flower, something there in the back. Perach Shoshanim, I don't remember exactly what it is. And over there, he has some idea that obviously is trying to explain why the Sephardic Siddur is so in line with Kabbalah and the Ashkenazi Siddur is not. And he gives some answer about Marana Bet Yosef being worthy of a Sephardic Kabbalistic Siddur, and the Rama feeling that the Ashkenazim were not worthy of such a Siddur. And because of that, the Hasidim took the Kabbalistic Siddur of the Sfaradim, but made it work for something historical. It's not. But it's very interesting to see what his opinion was, and really I'm assuming his purpose is to try to explain why the Hasidim abandoned the Ashkenazi Siddur in favor of whatever Sephardic Siddur they put together. Are you familiar with Nosach Sefarad? Not the Sephardic one, Sefarad of the Hasidim. Anybody here familiar with this Nosach? Yeah? Anybody pray this Nosach? In school, that was the Nosach used? Yeah. Okay. And what did you pray at home? Ashkenaz. What are any differences you noticed between Sepharad and Ashkenaz? Anything that stuck out to you?
Yeah, there's some stuff that was like the wrong way around. They added an extra word. Well, not the wrong way, but just a different
very good. Okay, so that was some things that are different. They're in different orders or extra words added here and there. As somebody who grew up in a Sephardic home, praying Sephardic, and then going to a Chabad synagogue, praying their Nosach Ha'ari according to the first Lubavitch Rebbe, and then going to a day school that prayed Nosach Ashkenaz, and later in life running through some places Nosach Sefarad, I can tell you what is unique about Nosach Sefarad is that it really feels, to someone who's familiar with the Nuschaot, Nosach Ashkenaz flows. It flows exactly like an Ashkenazi Siddur would flow. The Sephardic Siddur, it flows like a Sephardic Siddur would flow. Nosach Sefarad, it flows like if you're driving an off-road vehicle on a bumpy road and things are flying around all over the place. Chacham Ovadia Yosef refers to Nosach Sefarad as Nusach Ashkenaz HaMeshubash. The messed up Nusach Ashkenaz. That's how he calls it. And the reason is there are words there that clearly don't belong, or they're repetitive. They're using two different words, one that is found in the original Nusach Ashkenaz and one that is added from the Arizal's Kavanot, or things that are in different orders. Like an example. In Sephardic Siddur, Shema Kolenu, Adonai Eloheinu, Av HaRachaman, Chus V'Rachem Aleinu. We say, Hashem, hear our voice, Av HaRachaman. In the Sepharad, the Hasidic version of this, it says, Av HaRachaman, Shema Kolenu. Now we know that that blessing starts with the word Shema Kolenu, and we know that the Arizal intended for the words Av HaRachaman to happen after Shema Kolenu. But for whatever reason, whoever put together that Siddur, put it in that direction. There are some Hasidim who have adjusted that, and they've flipped the order around. But you can tell that a man-made edition of the Siddur is what's in front of you, and that has been tampered by people who maybe didn't always understand, or maybe they did, but they did it differently than how anybody else would. That's all. I said my piece. Back in the day, Rabbi Shlomo Goren, alav shalom, was the chief rabbi of the Israeli army. And he wanted in the Israeli army, listen, you can't have an Ashkenazi minyan, and a Sephardic minyan, and a Hasidic minyan, and a Yemenite minyan. Like in the army, you have to figure out what you guys are doing. Sometimes there's barely a few soldiers on the base for a minyan. What are you going to do? And so he suggested what he called Nosach Achid, the united Nosach, which is really just Nosach Sefarad with a new label on it. But it didn't work. For the Ashkenazim, it didn't work because it had extra words that don't belong there. For the Sepharadim, it didn't work because it was missing, and it was a completely different order than what they were used to. And how many Hasidim were drafted to the Israeli army that it would work for them? So really what happened is, even though the Siddur was standard issue, I'm not sure that it's really used anymore at all. I'm not sure. You'd have to ask. It could be my friend, Rabbi Josh Gerstein, is the rabbi of Nachal Haredi. I wonder what they use in his unit. The second, Gam benosach ha-piyutim enam mishtavim. So the second difference that Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine says is when it comes to the piyutim, the songs in the Siddur, they're not the same. So if you look at footnote 45, Sepharadim kiblu alehem piyutei tefilotam. The Sepharadim accepted into their Siddurim the piyutim, the songs, the poems of Gvirol. Who is Gvirol? What's his name? Rabbi Shlomo Even Gvirol. He was one of the giant poets of Spain. He wrote a beautiful work called Nifchar Peninim. By the way, it was translated in London in the early 1900s. You can get a copy with Hebrew and English, though the English is obviously an older English. There are newer editions that are only in Hebrew. Nifchar Peninim is a beautiful book, almost like Pirkei Avot, of teachings, of sayings, of wisdom that Rabbi Shlomo Even Gvirol is busy teaching us. One word of advice there that has always stuck out to me, and I share it almost every time I mention his name. Rabbi Shlomo Even Gvirol asks, what is the best type of friend to have? How do you determine, what character trait do you find in a friend that you know this person should be your friend? And he suggests the best character trait in a friend is that when your friend becomes your enemy, they will not betray your secrets to anyone else. That's the best friend you should look for. The type of friend that when they become your enemy, they will not betray your secrets. I think this is very wise words of advice. You share things with people when you're close, when you're friends. How many times couples that were together and today they're not, and the things they share with people. I mean, you come to me as a rabbi to share with me things, but you're slinging mud at a person. You're sharing with me secrets that this person trusted with you. They confided in you in the most intimate of times, and you feel comfortable just throwing it at me. That's a betrayal of a friendship. Today you're not friends, but when you become my enemy, I know that your lips are still going to be sealed. It's an important midah. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, which wrote which book? We studied it here. The Kuzari, very good. We studied it here for many years. It's a mistake. It's a mistake that in Jewish schools, Kuzari is not taught from the beginning until the end. This book is one of the most important works that we have. I think the Gaon of Vilna said about the Kuzari, but I'm bringing for you from an unlikely camp, that Kol Emunat Yisrael Talui Bo. All of the faith of the Jewish people is built into the Kuzari. Rabbi Moshe ben Ezra. Rabbi Moshe ben Ezra is not Rabbi Avraham ben Ezra. Rabbi Moshe ben Ezra has a tragic life. He wanted to marry his niece of his older brother, and it didn't work out because the older brother married off his daughter to a different brother. So the niece ended up marrying an uncle anyways. And Rabbi Moshe ben Ezra spent the rest of his life heartbroken that he wasn't able to marry the love of his life. His songs are heartbreaking, heart-wrenching. Rabbi Moshe David Gaon, in his book, Yehudei HaMizrach Be'eretz Yisrael, writes about Rabbi Moshe David Gaon that he was, in quality, one of the most superior poets of Sepharad, more than anyone else that came before him. And there are further Chachamim that we have their songs in our Siddur. Ashkenazim received theirs from Rabbi Eliezer Kalir. The Kalir, there are some people who want to say this is the son of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. I don't know what to tell you who was the Kalir exactly. Kalir might mean the cake maker, something to do with his profession. If you look here in Kehillat, Rabbi Avraham ben Ezra's commentary on the 5th chapter of Kehillat, you will find a scathing rebuke of all of the poems of the Kalir that are found in the Ashkenazi Sidurim today. Rabbi Avraham ben Ezra he didn't mince words. It's a rebuke is very, very harsh. I'm not going to say cruel, but very harsh. And even harsher on the people that are still singing those piyutim. I recommend, if you have time and you have the Hebrew skills, to look up the Ibn Ezra in the original. That's Kehillat chapter 5 in the first pasuk. Uvesof Machzor Vitri, says Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine, at the end of Machzor Vitri, Matzati harbe mipiyutei Sefarad she'Ashkenazim noagim lomram. I found in the back of the Machzor Vitri many of these Sephardic piyutim that it seems like the Ashkenazim used to say them, and for whatever reason, they don't say them anymore. So we mentioned so far the nosach of the tefillah and the piyutim. Maybe tell me why the piyutim are separate from the nosach of tefillah. Why today? I'm pretty sure that if you would ask what's the difference between Sepharadim and Ashkenazim and their siddur, people would say piyutim. Why is he treating these two things differently? That's not a trick question. It's one you can answer.
Maybe because one is part of the skeleton, not the skeleton, but you know what I mean? And then the other one's like a separate.
Yeah, very good. That's the answer that I would give. You have the nosach, the tefillah. That's skeleton is a word. It's the body of the tefillah, and then you have all of these piyutim that have been added to it over the years. Those piyutim are not the main part of the tefillah. They're parts of the tefillah that were added in later. That's going to be a different part of what separates Sepharadim and Ashkenazim, where in tefillah you're allowed to insert the piyutim. We'll get there. On the top of page 18 in the Roman numerals. Gimel. And this is so out of order, so that I have no idea why Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine lists things in this order, but they are as they are. Sepharadim neorim kol halayla, bezayin shel Pesach v'hoshana rabba. The Sepharadim are awake the whole night on the 7th of Pesach and on Hoshana Rabbah. V'toki'in b'shofar b'shat hazayin hakafot b'filat shacharit. And they blow the shofar when they do the 7 hakafot in the morning of those holidays. V'en ken minhag Ashkenaz, and this is not a minhag Ashkenaz. So the Ashkenazim don't do this at all. Look at footnote 46. Minhag Sefarad ba lehem imot ha'ari. The custom of the Sephardim came to them from the days of the Arizal. Ayen b'Shaar HaKavanot, look in the Shaar HaKavanot written by Rabbi Chaim Vital, over Pri Etz Chaim as well. Tam atkiot, why we blow the shofar, mipnei shemarbin bo tachanunim v'slichot, because it's a day where they add all kinds of supplication prayers. Aval haSfaradim be'eretz Yisrael en tokin, the Sephardim in the land of Israel do not blow the shofar. Rel harav Pri Hadama, look in the writings of the Rav Pri Hadama, one of our Chachamim. VaSefaradim beLondon veAmsterdam tokin. And the Sephardim of London and Amsterdam, they blow the shofar. Is anyone here actively part of a Spanish-Portuguese Kehillat that could tell me if this is the minhag on the ground today?
What's the thing? What's the question?
Blowing the shofar in the morning of the 7th of Pesach and Hoshana Rabbah. Some kind of hakafot that happened with the blowing of the shofar.
I know that by the Hasidim, at least I come from, they do that on Hoshana Rabbah, but not on Pesach.
Not on Pesach. Okay. Mord, what about?
We do Hoshana Rabbah, not Pesach.
Not on Pesach either. Okay, but Mord, the blowing of the shofar happens on Hoshana Rabbah?
As far as I'm aware, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So. Right. Okay. So this is something that still is around. By the way, it could be why none of you are familiar with the 7th of Pesach. It's very simple. I mean, it's not so simple actually. I recall seeing in one of the writings of Chachamei Sfarad that the 7th of Pesach, the idea of staying up all night on the 7th of Pesach, is an early Sabbathian custom. So this comes not from the Arizal. It's not found in the writings of the Arizal. It's found in the writings of Shabtai Tzvi. A proof to that, if I recall correctly, is that according to the Arizal, one of the nights in which a husband and wife are supposed to be together is the 7th night of Pesach. And so because of that, we know that it couldn't be from the Arizal that he would suggest that all the men go to the Beit Knesset and stay up on the 7th night of Pesach. There's a book the Sepharadim have, we don't have it on our Kriyei Moed, I think it's called. It has all the things you say when you stay up on Shavuot, when you stay up on Hoshana Rabbah. And in the newer editions of this book, the 7th of Pesach is written in tiny letters, meaning it's there because they didn't want not to print it, but it's really there and nobody uses it. The difference number 4. By the Sepharadim, Hachatan ve'akala yoshvim tachat hachupa kol shiva yemei hachupa ve'en ken minhag Ashkenaz. By the Sepharadim, the Chatan and Kala sit under the chuppah for all 7 days of Sheva Berachot, and by the Ashkenazim, that is not the case. Is anybody here familiar with the Sephardic community in which the Chatan and Kala sit under the chuppah for 7 days?
What does that mean, sitting in the chuppah?
So it can mean two things. It could either mean they stay at the place where the chuppah is, that's where they are, or that the chuppah comes with them to the places they go, perhaps. That it comes with them from house to house, and that's where they are. Is anybody familiar with such a minhag? So I've never seen it, but I have some thoughts. Look at footnote 48. No, Mechina 47. Semech leminhag Sefarad, not exactly a source, but a help, meaning a vague reference to maybe a possible origin of the minhag of Sefarad. Huma Yerushalmi is from the Talmud Yerushalmi. Hevio Harada, Rabbi David Abu Darham. Vayena Bet Yosef Ibn Ha'ezer Ma shekatav b'shem Orchot Chaim. And look in the Bet Yosef Ibn Ha'ezer in chapter 61, what he writes in the name of the Orchot Chaim. Now this actual minhag, I can't tell you that I've seen, but I will tell you something. Somebody help me out here. Has anyone ever been with some gung-ho Sephardim, preferably of the Rabbi Ovadia Yosef variety, Alav Shalom, when it comes to Sheva Berachot and whether or not you can say Sheva Berachot in a house that doesn't belong to the Chatan? Anyone familiar with the machlokat I'm talking about? This is much more common in Israel than I've seen outside of Israel. Harav Benji, you ever seen anything over there that differences between Sepharadim and Ashkenazim about Sheva Berachot?
I can't say I have.
Okay, so this
I've not been to that many Sephardi Sheva Berachot.
Okay, we have to get you invited, Benji. We have to get you invited. So, there is, Maran tells us in Shulchan Aruch that we're allowed to make the blessings of Sheva Berachot. Let's back up. Sheva Berachot. What are the Sheva Berachot? When do we first say them?
They're brought down in the Gemara and Kesubos.
Okay, very good. They're in the Megillah. When do we first say the Sheva Berachot with a couple?
At the chuppah.
At the chuppah. We then say again Sheva Berachot.
In a different order.
By the Birkat HaMazon of the Sheva Berachot. And then we do every night afterwards for 7 days, or every afternoon, whatever they do Sheva Berachot in different people's houses. That seems to be the custom nowadays. Everyone goes to other people's houses, they do Sheva Berachot, and that happens for 7 days, and Shalom on Israel. does one have an obligation, not at the chuppah? Talk to me about, let's say someone gets married on Sunday. So now, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, can they go take a vacation to the Bahamas, or do they have to stay in town for the Sheva Brachot? Is there an obligation to do a Sheva Brachot? I don't hear. Benji, I heard you, but I don't hear. Okay, Sarah says no. Pam is shaking her head no. Benji, what did you say?
Yeah, I said that make out then you only need Sheva Brachot if they're having a Su'udah with a minyan.
Very good. So only if the Chatan and Kala are eating a meal where there is a minyan, then they say Sheva Brachot. But they don't have to say Sheva Brachot. There's no obligation here. I once had a situation where a couple wanted to take a honeymoon after their wedding, and no, you have to stay Sheva Brachot. They didn't want to stay, whatever it was. They had work coming. There was only time this year. They were going to get 7 days off. They wanted to leave town. Okay. They're already, it's not a matter of halakha, it's a matter of politics between family members, and I can't get involved. But Sheva Brachot are a thing you do only when you have a situation which works for Sheva Brachot. If you're with the same people all the time for Sheva Brachot, you cannot do Sheva Brachot every day because you need a new person or people at the Sheva Brachot, and maybe on Shabbat those laws are a little bit different, but that's the way this works. There are also certain couples that get married that are not required to do Sheva Brachot at all. If a person marries their divorcee, so then the Sheva Brachot might be 1 day, might be 3 days, depending on how you look at the poskim over there. Maran says you're not allowed to recite the Sheva Brachot unless you are in the home of the Chatan. So it's not just 10 people, it's not just 10 men, it's not just new faces. It has to be the home of the Chatan. Just for the record, I just mentioned now 10 men. I find it highly unusual that in so many places, in the Orthodox community today, only the Chatan is present for the Sheva Brachot. What do you say? Misameach Chatan im hakala. We rejoice the groom with the bride. But the bride is in a different room. She's behind a mechitza. She's in another building. I know that she's not even listening. All the men gather in for Sheva Brachot, and where's the wife? She's nowhere to be found. What kind of Sheva Brachot doesn't have the kala at the Sheva Brachot? When I got married, so I knew it was going to be a problem. I married into a family of Hasidim I told my wife, maybe we'll only have mechitza and the dancing. She's like, listen, you can do whatever you want. My parents won't come unless it's going to be a certain way. Fine, so we did it that certain way. But I had one request. That was a Sheva Brachot. I want to sit with my wife. And everything worked out until Shabbat Sheva Brachot. Shabbat Sheva Brachot we come, and I was in one room, and they put my wife in a different room. A different room, meaning Bichlan, a different room. So men did Kiddush here, the woman in a different room. And I was obnoxious a little bit. I don't know if I today would have been so obnoxious, but my wife, I would have listened to her. Lunch, I didn't listen to her. By Kiddush and by Sheva Brachot, I wanted my wife to be in the room so she should hear them. More than that I couldn't fight for, but that's what I asked for. Maran says that if you're not in the home of the Chatan, you cannot recite Sheva Brachot. You can only recite Hagefen and one of the other brachot of the Sheva Brachot. Have you ever seen somebody do Sheva Brachot and not recite all the Sheva Brachot? Probably not. My assumption is you've done the Sheva Brachot hopping around in different places, and this becomes a serious problem for Sepharadim who are literally understanding Maran. That should be myself in that category, and so I'm here to explain a little bit of a minhag, how things work a little differently than how other people might see it. If I'm anyways talking about Sheva Brachot, before I say anything, Sheva Brachot are not 7 separate blessings. What do I mean they're not 7 separate blessings? When you see the Sheva Brachot, how many blessings are there? How do you know if something is a separate blessing versus an independent blessing? What does an independent blessing look like?
When you say Baruch Hashem at the end.
Right, you say Baruch Hashem at the end. An independent blessing also has Baruch Hashem in the beginning. So imagine you say Asher Yatzar, right? Baruch Hashem, Asher Yatzar Adam Chuma, right? And then you end off Baruch Hashem again. Now, oftentimes in the morning, a person will say this blessing of Elohai, Neshamash, Natata Bi Torah, Taberata, and only at the end of that blessing is there Baruch Hashem, Hamerzin, right? This blessing is not an independent blessing. It is the blessing, Beracha Semucha Lechaverta. It's a blessing that is attached to the one that comes before it. So give me an example of the brachot, of the Sheva Brachot, that are not independent. They don't start with the words Baruch Hashem. Off the top of your head, those of you who know some Sheva Brachot, it doesn't have to be in order. Sameach tesamach, re'im ahuvim. Does that start with Baruch Atah Hashem? No. What else? Shos tasis v'tagel akara. It doesn't start Baruch Atah Hashem. Those berachot cannot be recited by separate individuals. Those berachot come together as a package. They must be said together. The original minhag in Sepharadim and Ashkenazim and everywhere in the world is that one person said all the Sheva berachot. You start with Borei Pri HaGefen and you end with the last, the seven, what they call it, bracha achrita. They call it the one they sing, Asher bara son tzibcha. One person recites all the Sheva berachot. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense, not in the realm of halakha, that the 7 blessings are split up between 7 different people. I saw Rav Moshe Feinstein, I think it was him. He said you can split it up between 4 people. If you break up the independent blessings and the ones that are berachot, asemuchot, achavatan, then you could do it that way. The bottom line is by haraperetz, as much as possible. When we can, we give all of the Sheva brachot to one person. Everybody should, to one person. The fact the world doesn't do that, you can justify any minhag in the world. But Sheva brachot should be recited by one person. So, that's it. So how do you get around Maran's problem with reciting Sheva brachot in the house that doesn't belong to the Chatan? Tell me in the olden days where the Chatan and Kala got married. Where did they get married? Not at a wedding hall.
In the house.
In the house. Yeah, in the house. The backyard of a house, the compound, a few families living together. The Chatan and Kala have a chuppah. They go to a yichud room, even Sepharadim. What does it mean, yichud room? They go to their apartment, their bedroom, their whatever it is that's over there. It could be in the compound. And then they come out and they have a celebration in the courtyard. So it could be 5 or 6 families all related living in the same courtyard, but in the middle they had a chuppah and a wedding. And the Chatan and Kala step out for a little bit and come back. That was the wedding once upon a time. Later you develop minhagim, get married in a synagogue, get married outside, under the stars, whatever. Everyone has different things. Those happen later. So where do you celebrate the wedding? In the house of the Chatan. Now you come to say Sheva Berachot. So where are you the second day? In the house of the Chatan. You do Sheva Berachot on the third day. Where are you? In the house of the Chatan. Once you uproot the Chatan from his home, it's no longer the house of the Chatan. You're not obligated in the Sheva Berachot. So the Chatan and Kala are there, fine, but you don't say all Sheva Berachot. That's why Maran says you don't recite all the Sheva Berachot. Now, that is all based beautifully on a Rambam. The Rambam says that a wise person first gets a job, then builds a house, buys a house, and then he gets married. And a stupid person first gets married, then finds a job, then builds a house. I'm not going to ask, I don't want to embarrass anybody, but you can ask myself, how many of us own our own homes? And how many of us owned our own homes before we got married? In today's, more don't answer that you got some $5 billion Yerusha, and because of that you bought yourself 3 mansions. And meaning the order today is different for whatever reason, but it's different. It could be that building a shack with mud and some sticks was easier to do, and today you have to find a loan and mortgages and payments. Okay, I'm willing to accept that. But in today's world, the Chatan and Kala most likely don't own their home, so they rent a home. So let's say you're in Yerushalayim. I'm sure we've all been in Yerushalayim. You're in Yerushalayim and the Chatan and Kala, their parents paid for a wedding at some 20-year-old couple. And then where's their home? Where do they live?
They bought a flat there. They had to buy the flat. That's part of the shidduch.
Oh, you're talking about a guy that comes from a good yeshiva. And of course, that's part of the criminal act of getting married in Israel. Is so let's say they're not as bad, Iman. They're not living with the parents. Even I didn't do that to you. Yeah, but they find them some basement apartment and underneath some building, half a bedroom, whatever it is over there, till they figure out their life, till they have kids, till whatever else. You think this Chatan and Kala, the day after their wedding, are happy with you and your 10 people, 20 people coming to crash their apartment basement? They don't even have real furniture. The couch is missing a leg. The chairs are broken. The table is scratched. Do you think they're happy with you coming to live with them over there? They're not happy. So HaPeretz's attitude is everywhere the Chatan and Kala go, that they set up a home for the Chatan and Kala today. Today, Sheva Brachot here, this is the home of the Chatan and Kala. How do you justify with Maran, and then they Maran? So there's, I think the Taz, by the way, is the one who says this. There's a custom that was in Morocco. In Morocco, it's a beautiful minhag. If we could do it today, I would recommend doing it today. they had this special bench. They called it a talamon. Maybe my mother knows this better than me. A talamon is like, imagine a sofa, like a couch of sorts, and it has on top of it a canopy. You've probably seen this in movies, some kind of Arabian type movie. It's a beautiful couch with a canopy on top. And this was at the wedding. That's the chuppah kivyachol. This moved with them, and every home they went to, they brought the special couch to the first night, to the second night, to the third night. And that means that no matter where the chatan and kala were, their home, their chuppah was traveling with them wherever they went. This is not a minhag that we see anymore. The world is either violating Maran or relying on the Taz. But this idea perhaps could be this concept of a talamon that was in the Sephardic communities of certain places, moving from home to home so the chatan and kala could say, this is our home and you are guests at our home. Let's look at number 5. Sepharadim omerim Hallel bivracha b'shnei lilot Pesach harishonim b'vet HaKnesset. Sepharadim recite Hallel with a blessing in the Bet HaKnesset on the first 2 nights of Pesach. That's obviously if you're living outside of Israel. Inside of Israel, it's only on the first night. V'Ashkenazim en noagim ken. And Ashkenazim don't have this custom. If you look in footnote 48, Ayen ma shekatavti beKeter Shemtob. Look what I wrote on this minhag in the Keter Shemtob. U'mekor minhag Sepharad ayen Yerushalmi berachot. They said, and there are a few sources for the Sephardic minhag in Yerushalmi berachot. And then he says here, minhag Sephardim ba'Algier k'minhag Ashkenaz. And the minhag of the Sephardim in Algier is like the minhag of the Ashkenazim. Ayen Bet Yehuda Ayash. Look at the writings of the Rabbi Yehuda Ayash. Who was Rabbi Yehuda Ayash? Rabbi Yehuda Ayash was perhaps the most famous Chacham out of Algeria. Rabbi Yehuda Ayash came to Algeria and standardized everything about the halachot in Algeria. One standard ketubah, one standard get, standard contracts between business partners, standard everything, standardized minhagim, halachot. He was an unbelievable influence on Algerian Jewry. I know Jews that follow Algerian traditions. Whatever Rabbi Yehuda Ayash said is what they do in their house until today. Rabbi Yehuda Ayash, over there, they didn't have a minhag to recite Hallel on the nights of Pesach, like the Ashkenazim. By the way, the Yemenite community also didn't have a minhag to recite Hallel on the night of Pesach. And there are some writings of Chaim Yosef trying to force the Yemenite community to obviously do this. He tried to make many communities do things the way that halachic approach was. Nonetheless, this is a difference of minhagim between Sepharadim and Ashkenazim. Number 6, and I told you they're very random and they're out of order. So why they're all here, I don't know. Sepharadim, afilu im bnei habayit rabim, even if on Hanukkah, even if there are many people in one home, Madikim ner echad. They light only one candle, meaning one Chanukiah. Ashkenazim kol echad madik ner leatzmo. By the Ashkenazim, everybody lights their own Chanukiah in their own home. This conversation here about ner Chanukah, it's famous. We've discussed it over Hanukkah. The Mehadrin, Mina Mehadrin. Is that upping the family? Is it upping the individuals? And how many candles do you really have to light every night of Hanukkah? When you're adding, what are you adding? This is an old conversation. He writes here in the notes, and I know there are people who don't agree with this assessment of this halakha, but he writes here, in footnote 49, V'ataz tama echa Sephardim nohagim bazeh ketosafot, v'Ashkenazim kerambam, he said, and the Taz is a little bewildered why the Sepharadim seem to be following the custom of the Tosafot, and the Ashkenazim seem to be following the custom of the Rambam. And he said, I'll bring you another halakha like this shortly. I would argue that not all Sepharadim understand them to not be following the Rambam and following Tosafot instead, but this is a class maybe for Hanukkah time when it comes. For right now, practically, I think this is one of the most tangible differences between a Sephardic home and an Ashkenazi home on Hanukkah are the amount of Chanukiot that are lit inside of a home. Now today, are there Sephardim who are lighting more than one Chanukiah? Of course. You send your kids to day school and every kid comes back with a Chanukiah, and every year they come with a new Chanukiah. And what do you want to tell your kid? You're not allowed to light a Chanukiah in my house. So it becomes complicated. I'm not going to lie, it becomes complicated. But in an ideal halachic world, Sephardim light one Chanukiah in the home, zehu, nothing more than that. I said in the home, really it should be outside of the home. When we get to Hanukkah, we'll talk about Hanukkah. The next difference. If we're already talking about candles, Sepharadim en madlikim ner belel Tisha b'av b'shat hakinot. The Sephardim don't light a candle, meaning they don't have the lights on for kinot on Tisha b'av. Ashkenazim madlikin, but the Ashkenazim do light candles. On footnote 50, Mikor leminhag Sefarad katav harosh b'shem he's bringing a source here. Okay, he's quoting a Radar, Rabbi David Abu Darham, that talks about when we say Nafla ateret roshenu, that our crown has fallen, the lights get dimmed in the Bet Knesset. If I'm familiar correctly with the way that the Sephardic and Ashkenazi world are today, that even in Sephardic synagogue, Ashkenazi synagogues, the lights are dimmed. They're not dimmed all the way. You have to still be able to read the keynote. Hopefully these laws are theoretical. We won't have these customs. We won't be having a Tisha B'Av this year. We'll be in Yerushalayim already. But in the case that it is that way, there seem to be varying customs about the lights that are used in the Bet Knesset when it comes to Tisha B'Av. This next one is fascinating because it has more to it than what Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine mentions. Chet. Sephardim. B'makom kriyat haTorah, sham gam ken mitpalelim. In the place where they read the Torah, what's that called? What's the place where you read the Torah? What's it called? A bima or? A shulchan, okay, or? Anyone here call it a teva? Yeah, also? Okay. Bima, teva, shulchan, whatever you want to call it. In the place where they read the Torah, that's also where they lead services from. Ashkenazim, kriyat Torah b'teva, v'atfilah b'amud ha'miyuchad b'tzad echad. By the Ashkenazim, they read the Torah at the bima, but when they lead services, they lead the services from the front of the room. Next to the Aron Kodesh is a separate podium. And the amud, they call it, and that is where they lead services from. Now, this actually has a halachic reason for it. The halachic reason is very interesting. Those of you who come to my Bet Knesset, so we're a small kehillat that isn't not so fancy. If you go to a Sephardic kehillat, and I'm certain that in the videos that I've seen of Spanish, Portuguese kehillot in the United Kingdom, they look this way. But even if you think of the Sephardic synagogues of Tzfat, tell me where the Torah is read from. What does that bima look like?
Canopies, like 4 posts.
Is it on the ground? Do you take steps to get there?
You take steps.
It's elevated from the rest of the room. It's like a stage in the middle of the place. You take steps and you go there, correct?
Yeah.
That's how it is in every Sephardic synagogue you saw in Yerushalayim, also in Sefat, also Maran, Rabbi Yosef Cairo synagogue. They're up there. That's on top of you almost. They're reading the Torah. So this presents a problem let's read in 51. Tam minhag Ashkenaz is because the Talmud says, Mishum she'asur la'amod b'makom gavoha, gimel tefachim o yoter kedei litpalel. You're not allowed to pray somewhere that is 3 tefachim high. What is 3 tefachim high? 1, 2, 3. Higher than that, you shouldn't be praying that high off the ground. Why? Why? What does it say? It's based on a verse in Tehillim. David HaMelech says, Mima'amakim kiraticha Adonai. I call out to you from the depths. It's actually why originally the minhag was that the teva was down. If you look in the Talmud, what do they say in the Talmud? Yored lifnei teva. He would go down to the teva. They used to lead services down. There was an idea like this. But definitely not to go high. High is considered arrogant. How can you go up to pray to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? And that's why the Ashkenazim have this minhag. Now, it doesn't solve the problem because in many fancy Ashkenazi communities that I've been to, the podium where the Chazan leads services is just on another stage in front of the Aron Kodesh. Am I correct? Meaning, there are steps to get up to the podium in the front of the room. There's one Ashkenazi synagogue I was in. I want to tell you, it was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I was there randomly in the middle of the Shabbat. And over there, they had a stage, but the amud was put down underneath the stage. So he was standing in front of the stage, but not on it, before it. That was unusual. Says Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine, ורמב"ם, ושם כתב הרעב"ד, אם יכול לרד למטה ויתפלל, if you can, you have to go down and pray. תם למנהג ספרד, so what's the reason why Sepharadim allow one to pray on that podium? כיוון שיש בתיבה דלת אמות על דלת אמות, because the teva, the platform where the chazan stands, the shaliach tzibur stands, is bigger than 4 amot by 4 amot, הרי היא כעלייה, that's already considered its own place, it's its own platform, ומותר להתפלל בה, and it's permissible to pray there. So let me ask you this question. Let's say you live in an apartment building. Are you allowed to pray on the second floor in your apartment building, or do you have to go downstairs to the basement to pray? You're allowed to pray in your apartment, of course. And because this place is its own domain, and I'm here praying. The same thing with the Sepharadim. The reason why those platforms are so big are because that's their own domain. This is already its own room, so to speak, almost. It's like being in an attic. And because of that, he's allowed to lead services there. Which in fact would make problems, because in those Ashkenazi communities where the podium is in the front of the room, and there's a little podium for the Chazan, maybe that little platform the Chazan is standing on is not big enough to be considered its own domain, and therefore you really solved one problem, but created a different problem. Now, I'll add here that if I recall correctly, there has been much conversation since the time of the Khatam Sofer in Orthodox Ashkenazi synagogues, how to differentiate themselves from Reform Ashkenazi synagogues. And part of that has a lot to do with the ritual side of the Beit HaKnesset. Where do you lead tefillah from? Where do you read the Haftarah from? Where do you face when you pray? So I'll give you an example. I once came to an Ashkenazi synagogue. Why? They asked me to read the Megillah. They had no one to read the Megillah for them. So I came. It was a big audience of people. And the way the room was set up was, it was easier for me to read to them if I was holding the Megillah and facing them. So what did I do? I took the shtender, I turned it around, and I faced them. You would have thought that I brought a ham and cheese sandwich in the middle of Yom Kippurim and I was going to eat it before you don't understand what happened over there. A tumult. The elders of the Kehillat, what do you mean you face over there? The Reform people face the community, Orthodox people face front, turn around and face the Torah. Unbelievable things. Unbelievable what happened to me. I mean, you needed my help. I came to help you, and now I'm Reform. Okay, wonderful. This has a lot of... There was a time where Reform Judaism decided to turn the bima around. What's the motivation? I don't know. Turn the bima around. There was a time where they decided to lead services this way or lead them that way, and because of that, that already became a hallmark of... If you remember, those of you who were here on Shavuot, I discussed the organ that was in the community of Algier, in Oran and Algier, and how Rav Kook mentions the Reform custom to have an organ in the synagogue. And he said, listen, we don't even know what you're talking about. Maybe where you're from, there's Reform thing. We don't know what you're talking about. Where we are, this is something that all the Chachamim have in their Beit HaKnesset, and it's fine, and nobody was mitzaftzef. Nobody ever chirped about this until you came to make a problem for us. These things are very important. If you notice, in an Ashkenazi synagogue, Kabbalat Shabbat is led from where? The Chazan recites Kabbalat Shabbat standing by the bima. And then when it comes time for Arvit, where does he go? Up to the front of the room, to the Amud. And when he reads the Torah, where does he stand? On the bima, facing the Aron Kodesh. But when he reads the Haftarah, what does he do? On the side. He goes to the side of the bima. All of these things you wouldn't find in a Sephardic Kehillat. And so these are differences about where one stands and where one doesn't stand when you read the Tefillah, when you lead the services. And are there exceptions to this? Absolutely. So you may find an Ashkenazi, everything happens to be, it could be. Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine is pointing out general differences. In number Tet, I think we'll do 2 more, we'll call it a day for today. Tet, Besimchat Hanukkah uPurim, En HaSepharadim v'Ashkenazim mishtavim. This was eye-opening to me when I got married. But this has a practical difference. If you look in the Shulchan Aruch, he mentions here in footnote 52, in Siman Taf Reish Tzadi Hei and Siman Ayin Resh Tet, Taf. Interesting, he doesn't want to write the other way. Okay. In those simanim in the Shulchan Aruch, Maran discusses whether there is an obligation to have simcha on Hanukkah. Do you have to be happy on Hanukkah? If you look in the Al Nisim, look in the Al Nisim and the Siddur. Sorry. It says here. And after all of this war, your children came to your home, and they cleared your sanctuary, and they purified your mikdash, and they lit candles in your holy courtyard. And they established these days in Hallel, praise, and thanksgiving. And you did miracles and wonders for them, and we give thanks to your great name. So they established we have to do a few things. We have to say Hallel and give thanks to Hashem. Do we have an obligation to be happy on Hanukkah? Which holiday do we, yes, have an obligation to be happy on? Sukkot, very good. What it says, "V'samachta b'chagecha," correct? That's an obligation. Now we maybe extrapolate from there to the other 3 festivals, fine. But the Hanukkah itself doesn't have a separate mitzvah of joy, of happiness. Purim also. Now maybe Mishtach L'Olam, B'Bim B'Simcha, fine, but in terms of a mitzvah of Purim, it doesn't exist. Now, there are definitely Jews in certain camps that have taken the mitzvah of not being happy very seriously. They're very not happy. That's how their miserable Judaism looks like. There's no mitzvah to be sad on Hanukkah. The question is if there's a legal obligation to rejoice on this holiday or to fulfill the mitzvot of this holiday. The Ashkenazim don't agree. By the way, it could be that even the Rambam mentions Simcha. I have to look again in the laws of Hanukkah there. But what we have a practical difference in the way these holidays are observed. When I got married to my wife, Hanukkah and Purim, in my home, in my community, are very happy days. We light candles, we sing songs, we eat some food even maybe. We don't have an obligation to eat meals on Hanukkah, but we do it anyways. Purim is a great day. We read the Megillah, we give Mishlach Manot, we Matanot Evyonim, we don't, you do whatever we do. We read everything, all the mitzvot of the day, even Zecher L'Machatzit Shekel and all the things that we do it fine, okay. But when it comes to my wife's family, already a month before Hanukkah, they're preparing, and it's a celebration, carnival. It's unbelievable. There's Tisha, and there's meals, and there's Yom Tov clothing, and the whole thing. Purim also, it's a production in its own right. And for a very long time, my wife felt like we had too simple of a Hanukkah experience, or too simple of a Purim experience. And I asked, Rosh Chodesh, what does Rosh Chodesh look like to you? Do you make carnivals on Rosh Chodesh and celebrations and wear Yom Tov clothes and you don't go to work? Is that what happens for you? Because Rosh Chodesh is also an important day in the calendar. And so we're not telling you not to be happy, but there are differences in the way that these 2 holidays are observed, especially as it relates to Simcha. And the last one for today, Sepharadim and Mevarchin ala Hallel b'dilug. Sephardim don't recite a blessing on Hallel when it is bedilug, when you skip certain paragraphs. Meaning, we call that today a half Hallel. We call it half Hallel. Ashkenazim mevachim gam bedilug, and Ashkenazim recite a blessing bedilug. Now, before you jump on me, don't jump on me yet. Footnote 53. Ayen Keter Shemtob. Look what I wrote in the Keter Shemtob. V'sham dibarnu ba'aruka, and there I elaborated at length. אבל הספרדים בלונדון ואמסטרדם נהגו כמנהג אשכנז לברך. The Sephardim of London and Amsterdam follow the Ashkenazi custom and they recite the blessing on the half Hallel. וכשבאו האשכנזים לשכון כבוד בצפת, and when the Ashkenazim came to live in Tzfat, נהגו שלא לברך משום שבאו בגבול מרן הבית יוסף. The Ashkenazim stopped reciting a blessing on half Hallel in the city of Tzfat because they now entered the territory of Maran HaBet Yosef. כך כתב בספר שנות חיים למורנו הרב שלמה קלוגר. That was written in the book Shnot Chaim of Rabbi Shlomo Kluger. This conversation about whether or not Sephardim recite a blessing on a half Hallel is very tricky. It's very complicated. You have to determine what it means to be Sephardi. You have to determine which Sephardim, who are you talking about. And I would say that what is familiar to me, those Sephardim who follow the Rambam exclusively certainly do not recite a blessing on half Hallel. Rambam is clear as day as to whether or not you're allowed to recite a blessing on half Hallel. Maran quotes a number of opinions, and yes, if you wanted to follow the standard procedure in Maran, it seems that he also is saying that it's forbidden to recite a blessing on a half Hallel. But what can I tell you? That of the tens of thousands, not 1,000, tens of thousands of Chachamim that came out of Morocco, for example, who all recited a blessing on the half Hallel. And the Chachamim here, based on Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine, is telling me, and you can correct me if that's not correct, but that in London and Amsterdam, the Sephardim there also recited blessing on a half Hallel. That there was a significant chunk of the Sephardic population that recited a blessing on the half Hallel. That's what they did. And it might tell you that it's a bracha levatala, that it's this, that it's that. I'm not getting involved. That's for a shiur on the laws of Hallel and whether or not you can recite a blessing on something that is minhag nevi'im and not a. That's a good conversation to have. And what do you do if you're in a Beit Knesset and they're Ashkenazim and they say a blessing? Or what do you do if you're Sepharadim and they don't say it? So that's already a complicated question. Really, it's not for me to get into today. But this is one of the differences, that in general, the Sephardim don't say a blessing on the half Hallel, and Ashkenazim do say a blessing on the half Hallel. If I could just throw this out there, one last thing about the Hallel. When Sephardim recite a blessing on the full Hallel, what is the blessing they recite? I don't know, maybe by you they say Liturgical, but from what I see, Ligmor et Hallel, to finish the Hallel.
Ashkenazim or the Sephardim?
Sephardim.
Oh, it's Ligmor.
So, very good. What do the Ashkenazim say on a full Hallel? Likro, to read the Hallel. Now, when the Sephardim who recite a blessing on the half Hallel recite a half Hallel, which blessing do they say? So when the Moroccans recite a blessing on the half Hallel, which blessing do they say? Likro the Hallel. The reason is, you can only say the blessing Ligmor the Hallel if you finish the whole Hallel. But if you're skipping parts of the Hallel, then you can't say Ligmor. You're not finishing the Hallel, but Likro, you're reading Hallel. The question then is, why do Ashkenazim recite the blessing Likro the Hallel when they read the whole Hallel? Why don't they say the blessing Ligmor the Hallel? If I recall my sources correctly, it starts with the Maharam of Rodenburg. And he feels, what happens if you're an Ashkenazi Jew and you're reciting the full Hallel and you forget a word or you skip a word or you mumble through a word or you miss a letter or something happens? Now the blessing that you recited in the Hallel is a blessing in vain because you missed a word. And so because of that, he instituted this non-Talmudic blessing, which is Likro et Hallel. Rabbi Peretz always would tell us that even if there was such a situation, you still wouldn't be violently Gemor at the Hallel. The Chazan is saying Hallel, the community is saying Hallel, a lot of people saying Hallel. Okay, let's leave it at that. But for today, we've discussed the first 10 differences that Rabbi Shemtob Gaguine gives us between Sepharadim and Ashkenazim. And I'm very much looking forward next time to get through at least 10 more of them until we finish this list. I wish you a good evening. I'm here to answer any questions or comments afterwards. But for right now, for those who need to go, thank you so much for learning with me tonight.